Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this, a Browning BDA 380 chambered in 380. Browning standing for Browning Double Action. Alright, now in order to talk about this gun, we are going to talk about a little bit of history. In the 1970s, FN decided that they wanted to update their small caliber pistol line. They had been rocking the Browning Model 1922, originally designed by John Moses Browning, for quite some time, or the FN designation thereof. Now, something that's important to keep in mind is for a very long time, the better part of the 20th century, FN and Browning kind of divided the world. FN would primarily market their guns in Europe, and Browning would primarily market their guns in the Americas. However, that line has blurred over the years, and now FN is an absolute titan in the military realm, which it kind of always has been, but it is most definitely selling guns in the Americas. Now, this gun would come about in a collaboration between FN, Browning, which are more or less the same company, but not completely, and Beretta, of which FN did kind of own a portion of, or perhaps it was Browning. Doesn't really matter. The business relationships here are not necessarily what we're talking about as much as the guns. In 1976, FN would unveil the 140DA, which would be chambered in 32 ACP. Browning would come out with the BDA 380, and Beretta would go with the Model 81 and 84, which would be chambered in 32 and 380 respectively. Now, Beretta would be visibly different from the 140DA and the BDA 380 in having Beretta's standard cutaway slide like you see on a Model 92. For whatever reason, Browning and FN did not go with that. I'm not entirely sure if it was because they wanted something that was stylistically different than the Beretta, or if there was some sort of like copyright type infringement that they didn't want to necessarily pay on for royalties or whatever it is that it may be. Not entirely sure, not really in the purview of this video. Now, the three guns would meet with very different results when it came to success. The 140DA would be sold in Europe. It would pick up with like one law enforcement agency and would end production in 1986. The BDA 380 would come to the Americas, where it would have modest sales. And I think the biggest issue is that when you talk about at least the United States, a 380 is generally considered to be some type of pocket gun. It's not something that's expected to be in this overall size dynamic. Whenever Americans are stepping up to a gun this size, they want it, especially in the 1970s and in the 1980s, they want it in 45 ACP. They want it in 38 Special, 357 Magnum, something that's larger, especially when you consider where ammunition development is at this point. There's not a lot of good defensive loads in the 380 to the 32 ACP to make them viable fight stoppers. At this time, people are going with larger diameter projectiles in order to be able to disrupt more tissue if their hollow points should fail, which they most likely would. FMJ ammunition would still be the order of the day, and when you're talking about 380, that's not really displacing a lot of energy or mass or disruption or anything like that in target media. If there was a place that the BDA 380 probably did well, it would be South America, where a lot of those countries have a ban on the private ownership of firearms chambered in military cartridges, of which the 380 is not. So 380 ACP is quite popular in South America. Now, the Model 81 and 84 would do the best out of the bunch, and actually has been updated. The 84 has been updated recently in the Beretta Model 80X, which kind of follows the same stylistic approach and features as the Beretta Model 92X, which is not really a subject of this video here today. The BDA 380 would cease production about 1996, 1997, and that pretty much brings us up to date on history. So let's go ahead and get into the features of this particular handgun. Right off the bat, we have a 3.8-inch barrel, which puts this in the same barrel length as a Glock 19. But when you look at the gun, you'd think it'd be a little bit smaller, at least when you look at the slide portion of this handgun. Honestly, the grip seems to command most of the size of this handgun. It's a fairly large grip with a pretty low profile slide on it. We'll talk about that more as we go through features and shooting. Our front sight is a blade type front sight, and we have a notch type rear sight. The rear sight is drift adjustable for windage. There's no real elevation adjustment on this, and there's no real contrast between the sights. I'll go ahead and try to line them up for you there real quick. Yeah, it's black on black. There's not a whole lot to really help these sights stand out. The slide is that enclosed design that I talked about earlier. The slide has definitely been refinished. There's some signs of pitting, and I actually just picked up some light surface rust, which I've been shooting this in some pretty pretty cold conditions here lately, so I'm gonna need to scrub that up a little bit later. Now you'll notice on the front here we have these dished cuts, which are pretty typical on like a Browning high power or a Beretta Model 92. This is actually pretty handy if you're wanting to do press checks or something along that avenue of approach. Press checks are kind of a hot topic discussion for an awful lot of people. First off, when you have them so close to the end of the muzzle, some people get really concerned with having their hand so close to the end of the gun. However, I would note that safe firearms handling practices never really go away. So if you're conducting a press check, you should probably have your finger off the trigger to begin with. So it really shouldn't be an issue in theory. Now, a lot of other people come up with an issue as far as like tactical elitism. Like, what do you think you are, John Wick, out here doing your press checks and stuff like that? However, guys, I go to a lot of competitions and courses and stuff like that, and I've seen it happen numerous times, and it's happened to me, where somebody is 100% convinced that their gun is loaded, and they step up to the line, and they get ready to go through that course of fire, and they draw and present their firearm, and they get a click, no bang, because it turns out the gun was not loaded. And, on a competition or something like that, you get a little bit of egg on your face, you're kind of embarrassed, and then you go on with your life. But in real life, that could be the difference between life and death. So I think it's exceedingly important to make sure that however it is that you do it, you check to make sure you know the condition of your firearm, because it's 2 seconds to know whether or not the gun is loaded. So be it chamber viewports, loaded chamber indicators, press checks, x-ray vision, I don't care how it is that you do it. I just care that you are 100% certain that your firearm is loaded whenever it is that you step out your door. All right, so enough about that. Let's go ahead and talk about this barrel. So this is what would commonly be referred to as a slam feed design. This is not a Browning tilting barreled action, which is not unusual because this is a blowback operated pistol. And it ostensibly is arranged in a very similar manner to a Beretta Model 92 with that fixed barrel design, but it does not have the, oh my goodness, I just forgot the name of that piece. I'll annotate it below, but it doesn't have the same construction as a Beretta. What I find interesting about this, though, is that generally whenever you talk about 380 blowback designs and stuff like that, you have a recoil spring that is wrapped around the barrel. That is not the case. In this case, we have, oh my goodness, we have a standard guide rod and recoil spring setup. Kind of unusual for these small caliber blowback designs. Generally, I would expect to see something more akin to a Walther PPK or like a Makarov or something along those lines, where the spring is wrapped around the barrel. So we don't really see that here, and I find that to be a very interesting design feature. Now, we do have a loaded chamber indicator that is connected to our chamber. When it's exposed, it's supposed to give you like a little sliver of red. However, that paint has long ago worn away. Ostensibly, this would be tactile, but I have never really trusted tactile loaded chamber indicators. The closest I've gotten to trusting one would be the one on the Sig M17, which stands out on top of the chamber. However, I've also seen like carbon and stuff like that get built up underneath that loaded chamber indicator, and it exposes itself when it's not actually loaded. So that's why I still default to press checks, and I don't really rely on loaded chamber indicators. Plus, a lot of loaded chamber indicators are so low profile that they're tactile, but I wouldn't bet on my life on it, not in a low light situation or anything along those lines. I would sooner pull that slide back a little bit and use a light to be able to inspect my chamber. Now, you'll notice that our cocking serrations on the slide are set kind of far forward, and that's because we have a safety that we're going to talk about here in a moment. They're deep cut, but there's not a lot of gripping surface area, which I find kind of weird. Like, it kind of comes back to this being a pretty low profile slide overall. Now, our safety is kind of a Beretta safety decocker. It is ambidextrous, and it will lower the hammer from the decock position and remain in the lowered position. I've never been a big fan of slide mounted safeties because you run the possibility of accidentally functioning the safety should you be clearing a malfunction or overhand racking the slide, however it is that you work around the slide. So you could very well come off of a reload or something like that and have a dead trigger, and that and just simply needing to turn your safety back off. You just may not necessarily recognize that if your drill is to go straight into a tap rack bang. You're still not going to have an active trigger should you do that until you turn off the safety. So actually, like immediate action on the Beretta, one of the on like the M9, one of the steps was to check to make sure that your safety had not been turned on. Now, when it comes to decockers, early decocker designs could run into an issue where they would discharge whenever it was that they were lowered, and that had a lot to do with some type of like mechanical failure or fatigue. I would not consider that to be a possibility on this particular handgun. That is because when you turn the safety on, it actually pulls the end of the firing pin that the hammer would interact with flush with the face of the slide. So there's really nothing for the hammer to impact, but also the hammer, you can see that there, is lowered to the half cock position. So it is not resting against the firing pin anyway. So you would need like 2 points of mechanical failure for this gun to discharge when you lower the hammer. However, I would still consider it to be a case of safe firearms handling practices, which is keeping the gun oriented in a safe direction anytime that hammer falls. Just some practices you're just not going to get away from. Now, something that we might not have noticed earlier, we do have a Beretta style takedown as well, which we have a button on this side that allows us to release this lever so that we can remove the slide. Our slide release is single-sided, which is pretty typical for the time frame that this gun came out. It can be reached with the thumb. However, it's very, I just barely get pressure on it. I don't necessarily have the longest thumbs, but I have kind of like average or kind of large on the larger side of average hands. And I would not consider this to meet my requirement of a good slide release, which is that I need to be able to reach my safety, which I can, my slide release, and my magazine release, all without really having to drastically change my grip. So this might be something that you better benefit from whenever it is that you do a mag change, slamming that magazine in and then using your support hand to hit the slide release. That's not my preferred method, because I just want this hand to go straight into building my firing grip as opposed to functioning anything else, any other stops along the line. But if you train that enough, you could do it just as quickly as hitting the slide release. Ultimately, for me, it doesn't really matter because I overhand rack all my guns, because overhand racking works with everything. But that is to acknowledge that hitting the slide release is actually the faster way to reload. I just have this manual of arms refinement because I shoot so many different firearms and I train and compete with so many different firearms. All right, enough about that. Let's go ahead and talk about this trigger. It is a double action, single action trigger. So our first round is double action and our subsequent shots are in single action after the slide cycles. So we can see there, now we are in the single action mode. Our double action trigger has a lot of stacking right at the end. However, overall, it's fairly smooth. We do have a serrated trigger on the face here, which is kind of typical whenever it is that we're talking about foreign imported guns needing different amounts of like points and stuff like that on handguns to be for a sporting purpose. Apparently, a serrated trigger is a sport shooting feature. So it's relatively heavy, which is kind of expected for a double action trigger, but it's still fairly smooth. It's easy for me to be able to keep my sights on target throughout the trigger stroke. It's just that I notice at the end, in order to be able to maintain that sight picture, I do have to slow it down quite a bit. Our single action trigger, on the other hand, is pretty crisp. It's a little heavy, but there's not a whole bunch of stacking or anything like that. It's not mushy or anything along those lines. And our reset is very short and we are right back on the wall. So it's got a fairly decent single action trigger. You'll also notice that we have a little nub on the back of the trigger there. That is an over travel stop, which kind of helps us with that reset. So this is built to put us like pretty much right back on the wall. For a 380, this has a really decent trigger. We'll talk about that more as we get into some observations and stuff like that here at the end. Our magazine release is located in the American location at the corner of the trigger guard. It is reversible to either side, and it does drop those magazines out pretty cleanly. I haven't had any real issue with that. Let's get to our grips. Now you can see here I have these wood grips on here, and you'll also notice that the medallions are missing because for some reason these grips shed their medallions like it's their job. I've had two different sets of these grips. I had the original grips, the medallions fell off. I was like, whatever, I guess I'll just live without the medallions. And then I happened to be in a gun shop, looked in the $5 bin, and found another set of grips for this gun that still had the medallions. Put them on there, and like the first time I took them to the range, the medallions fell out. So apparently they're just not meant to have medallions in them. You can get Pachmayr grips for these guns. I don't care for Pachmayr grips. I've not put them on here. The grips are very smooth, and there's not like any texturing on the front or back strap of the gun either. However, I haven't really found that to be an issue for control. We'll talk about that more once we get into shooting. We do have a little bit of a lip here that projects at the bottom of the grip. You find these on like Sigs and Berettas and stuff like that. It's kind of supposed to channelize your grip and allow you to have a nice firm grip. I'm not too big of a fan of that because I actually like to keep my bottom fingers kind of loose on the grip as it is, and I do most of my gripping with my support hand, so I don't really think that this is all that helpful. And actually sometimes if I do like kind of revert to lizard brain and really bear down on this gun, it'll cause me to dip the muzzle a little bit while shooting. Now, something that's important to point out here is that we do have a magazine disconnect safety. As you can see here, we are on fire. I'm pulling the trigger with no magazine in it, and the hammer is not moving. I absolutely despise magazine disconnect safeties. However, this is not the worst. On some handguns, the magazine disconnect safety has an impact on the trigger. As I mentioned before, this has a fairly decent trigger. Also, on some handguns, the magazine disconnect impacts whether or not the magazine drops free. However, this magazine comes out pretty easily, so it's not really necessarily that big of an issue there either. My biggest issue is a kind of safety issue, which is funny because the magazine disconnect exists because of safety type considerations. This way, if you're cleaning your gun and you still have a round in the chamber and you go to pull the trigger for some reason, you don't accidentally shoot yourself. Good firearms handling, once again, good firearms handling practices still apply. So clearing your gun before you go messing around with it, cleaning it, training with it, whatever, is still a necessary step, regardless of whether or not you have a magazine safety. So my biggest issue with this is if for some reason your magazine gets bumped, but it's still in the gun and you don't know it, you don't have a functioning trigger. You're unable to fire that round in the chamber up until you seat that magazine again and get back into work. I've heard of some police departments with that demanded magazine disconnect guns and would have their officers walk around with the magazines partially extended. I don't know how true that is. I heard a rumor about it, and I hope it's not true because that's absolutely ridiculous. So not only does your officer have to already he's potentially struggling for the use of his gun, now he has to smack that magazine in order to be able to use it. That's silly. That's just like carrying a gun without a loaded chamber, which is a discussion for another time. Overall, our grip dimensions are very similar to Beretta. That just kind of like popped in my head here, with that hump and stuff like that there in the back. Our magazine capacity is 13 rounds of 380, which is pretty decent. Up until here recently, you didn't have a lot of guns that carried this many rounds in the 380 chambering. So that's pretty cool. I do appreciate that. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers features. How does it shoot? All right, so this gun is an absolute joy to shoot. I actually had, and this is important to point out here, I actually had to refilm this because I ran into some issues. We'll talk about that here in a second. First off, let's talk about these sights. These sights do not stand out. And even if I came in here and put some like paint on them or something like that, that front sight is very small. It's a teeny tiny front sight, and it is very easy to misread this front sight whenever it is that you're like transitioning across targets and stuff like that. It's very easy to lose it and then spend some time kind of like bringing it back. My presentation for the most part gets me on it. It's more when we get into recoil management that sometimes things get a little loosey-goosey. Now, when it comes to recoil and all that kind of stuff, this is a very light recoiling gun. It's very easy to manage because you have, like, first off, there's not a lot of weight. We have a steel slide on an alloy frame, but also we have a lot of grip to be able to control muzzle flip and all that kind of stuff. It's very easy to get into this gun and to be able to shoot it pretty accurately and pretty quickly overall, as long as you can keep on that front sight. Now, formerly, I had never had any issues with these guns up until this gun, up until I took it out to the range, and I think I was shooting Winchester White Box, and I noticed that I was not getting last shot hold open. So I'm sitting here thinking like, okay, well maybe I'm riding the slide catch or something along those lines. Monitored for that and stuff like that, found that I was not in any way riding the slide catch, and it was just legitimately the gun was not locking back, which technically counts as a malfunction. It might be the most mild form of malfunction, but it's still technically a malfunction. So that kind of bugged me a little bit. I took it back out to the range with different ammunition and got the gun to lock back. However, on this particular range day, it had just snowed and I was doing 1 reload 1s, and my magazines were getting caked with like snow and sand and stuff like that. And something that I found about these magazines is that they are a magnet for debris. Like, I've never seen anything like it. It's like it just coats itself in it for some reason. And it was definitely causing, it eventually induced some malfunctions, which honestly, if you think about it, yes, weather conditions like that, be it mud, sand, snow, whatever it is that it may be, if you start jamming that into your gun, you are absolutely going to have malfunctions. I took it home, scrubbed it, made sure I got it nice and clean, and then this gun ran flawlessly after that. Now, my most recent range trip, I actually took this out in 8-degree weather, and I will say that my first iteration out of the gun did result in no slide lock. But after that, after that kind of like warmed up, the gun had no malfunctions. The only, well, I say that, I did induce some malfunctions, but that was with my glove, and I was putting too much pressure on the slide, and I was slowing down velocity. Now, we are talking about sub-freezing temperatures at this point. And this may not necessarily be a combat-style handgun designed to be able to work in those conditions. However, when it came to inducing the slide malfunctions, all I had to do was move my thumb over, and then the slide would go fully in the battery to allow me to be able to fire the next shot. So they were, yes, technically malfunctions, but when you consider the weather conditions, like we're in winter now, when you consider the weather conditions I've shot this gun in, and I've been a little brutal to it, more so than I have been to other handguns in the past, I think this gun performed pretty well overall. Alright guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on shooting. I do want to go ahead and talk about some stuff that I use with this. So on the occasion that I carry this handgun, I carry it in this DeSantis 106 leather inside the waistband holster. The gun does poke a little bit out the front there, but with that kind of low profile blade type front sight, it doesn't catch on anything. It's not really been an issue. And then I also have 2 magazines for this gun. I have the magazine that it came with, and then also I have a Metgar produced magazine. This seems to be the magazine that I've had more failure to lock problems with, which, I mean, this is the original mag, so it could be getting a little bit worn out. And from yesterday's shooting, there's definitely still some debris on this one. I need to scrub those magazines again. All right, guys, what are my recommendations when it comes to this handgun? Would I recommend this for duty type use? Absolutely not. I consider the 380 chambering to be marginal for self-defense to begin with. I would not use it as a dedicated duty type cartridge. And with this handgun, not necessarily having the ability to mount lights or anything along those lines, I would not recommend this for duty use based on that, as well as things like the magazine disconnect, the small chambering. overall, this is not, in my opinion, this is not a modern duty gun. This would not replace anything else that is in that duty category on the market right now, in my opinion. Well, what about self-defense, home defense? Well, for a self-defense handgun, I think this would work out pretty well overall. One of my lingering issues with this gun is the fact that I really can't swap out this front sight. And I highly doubt that there's a lot of replacement rear sights for this gun anyway. But this front sight is milled into the slide. There's no replacing that. So it's not like I can put higher visibility sights or night sights or anything like that on this gun. I am stuck with these kind of very low profile 1970s defensive style sights. Not necessarily a win. Not my favorite thing by a long shot. So that is something that I think it needs to be considered if you're considering this for a concealed carry gun. However, it's ease of shooting, its capacity, the fact that, you know, it drops these magazines so cleanly and all that kind of stuff. This would have a lot of really good applications as a defensive firearm for your common defensive applications. So, you know, you're talking like maybe 2 assailants, something along those lines. You know, you're not necessarily gonna, this is not the gun that I would choose to face down a gang, a motorcycle gang of like clowns or something along those lines. But I would consider this to be a fantastic option for, you know, the vast majority of us who are probably never going to be in a self-defense situation in our lives. And you're definitely not going to be in more than one. So this could work. This would be kind of more towards the marginal side of things for a self-defense application. What about home defense? This would not be my first choice for home defense. That's not to say that I haven't used this as a home defense option, as much as we don't have lights. We don't really have a night fighting capability with this handgun, and there's a higher probability that when we're talking home defense situations, we're going to be fighting at night. But when it comes to chambering and capacity and all that kind of stuff, size of the gun, I do think that this is kind of applicable. I could see this being your self-defense gun, and then you come home and you put it on your nightstand and it becomes your home defense gun at that point. It's just your one gun type application. But I would prefer to see a light for something like that. I would prefer to see more options available to us. And when we're talking a home defense gun, we're not necessarily talking about it weighing down our belt or anything along those lines. So we can preference larger, heavier guns for home defense if we want to. So something to kind of keep in mind with that. And something we frequently discussed on the channel. What about as a competition gun? You could take this in a competition and it would perform just fine. 380 is kind of expensive if you're going to do a steady diet of competing with this handgun. So I don't necessarily know how long-term sustainable it's going to be for you when it comes to your wallet. I think it performs just fine. I would prefer to see higher profile sights. I prefer to see higher contrast between the sights for a dedicated competition type use. But if this is a gun that you carry, I would urge you to compete with it at some point in order to make sure that you're getting in that good kind of training, placing it against a metric that is not your own so that you can evaluate how well it is that you're doing, base yourself against other people, however it is that you want to do it. I think one of the biggest things about competition is you have to keep in mind what it is that you want to get out of it. If your whole purpose here is to get sponsors and win trophies and stuff like that, this may not be the best choice. If your purpose is to try to drive yourself to do better and kind of grade yourself against your own metrics, this would not be the worst choice if you plan on carrying this as a concealed carry option. Okay, what about like a woods gun or something along those lines? No. I would not recommend this. There's a lot of options that are way better for that type of purpose. So this would not be a high recommendation for me in this case. All right, well, those are my recommendations. What are my uses for this handgun? I have had 2 uses for this gun. I've carried this gun upon occasion. It's not my favorite because, again, I don't really care for the slide mounted safety, though at least with this gun, this slide mounted safety is much closer to my thumb. On a Beretta or something along those lines, I have to reach a little bit further to be able to actuate it, unlike the M9 or the 92 FS. However, I don't necessarily like the additional step of having to actuate this safety, and it's not like a thumb safety or something like that that's much closer to me already building my grip, like on a 1911, or if I was carrying my CZP07 cocked and locked, something along those lines. That's what I would prefer to see for safeties on carry guns. But I do carry this. To get back to the point, I do carry this upon occasion. But I think my biggest use for this handgun has been as a training tool. because it's so light recoiling, but it's still in a larger cartridge than like a 22, it's a really good step up from taking somebody from a semi-automatic 22 to now, okay, here's some recoil management. In addition to, here's a double action, single action trigger. So teaching somebody how to work through that double action first trigger pull into the single action follow-ups and stuff like that. This, you know, on a light recoiling platform like this, that's a really fantastic option. And it's something that honestly has kept this as a viable gun. This is not my favorite defensive handgun by a long shot. It's really not even my favorite handgun by a long shot. But as a training tool, it has been indispensable to me. So at times I think about like, well, you know, I could, you know, offload this and get something better in the same overall category. But then I think back about how much utility I've gotten out of this gun when teaching new shooters, and it just, next thing you know, it's just still sitting in there in the safe. So I imagine that this gun's going to stick around for a while longer as both a defensive option and a training tool. All right, guys, now something that I've been considering adding for a little while is also, let's go ahead and talk about competitive offerings out on the market. So this gun, no longer in production. So unless you're like really dedicated to this idea, or you're really into Brownings or something like that, or you just happen to find one of these for a really great price at a pawn shop or something like that, you're probably not going to necessarily buy this handgun. But what would be some other options out on the market that are similar to it if you're interested in this overall size and cartridge dynamic? First off, we have the Beretta Model 80X, which is an updated version of the Beretta Model 84 Cheetah and would be within the family of the BDA 380. It's going to give you optics, it's going to give you better sights. I've heard some mixed reviews on that handgun, but it would be worthwhile to take a look at it if you're wanting a hammer-fired 380 with some modern features on it. And then another really great option would be the Glock Model 25, which just recently started getting imported into the United States. And that is a Glock 19 size 380. It's still a blowback operated gun, but it's going to be larger than your average 380, be that a Ruger LCP or anything along those lines. And it's going to give you more gun to be able to grip and be able to manage the recoil and all that kind of stuff with an already fairly lightly recoiling cartridge when you combine it with a larger overall platform. So if you have somebody who's recoil sensitive, if you have somebody who is maybe not up to like full strength in their hands and stuff like that, these handguns, these three handguns that we've discussed here today, would be really good options to that person. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.